I'm not sure why I take off my glasses to take a drink of water, but I do. Well, several weeks ago, our family was at the public demonstration that took place at the Reno County Courthouse on a Sunday afternoon. And it was being held in response to the recent killing of George Floyd. And there were a lot of powerful words spoken that day. And there was one powerful question. One of the speakers, and now I'm not exactly sure which one, told a story. The speaker was white, and one day she had been working with or in conversation with some black teenagers. And one of the teenagers, a young man, asked her this question: how can I make white people not afraid of me? How can I make white people not afraid of me? Not, how can I make them not hate me? But how can I make them not be afraid of me? Well, how do you answer a question like that? How would you answer that question? If you're a white person, how would you answer that question? How would you answer his question if you were his parent? It's a heartbreaking question because if you sit with it, you can hear his despair, his hopelessness, and his confusion. And I'm not quite sure how I would go about answering it. But one thing I hope I wouldn't do is to try and tell him that he's mistaken. To tell him that white people really aren't afraid of him. Because he knows. He knows that for whatever reason, white people see him as a threat. Because he feels the eyes on him when he is walking alone through a neighborhood. Because he sees the suspicious glances when he and his other black friends are hanging out at the local mall. He knows because this is the sort of thing that black parents have to talk about with their children. If they're going to protect them and keep them safe as possible. Black parents have two talks. One involves birds and bees, and one involves the color of their children's skin. And it's not just black parents. But white parents who have adopted black children have to have these conversations. I remember three or so years ago when I went to Fuller Seminary for a week intensive course on hospitality, that one of the other students who was taking this, he had a large family, and he was a white student, a couple of his kids he had adopted, and they were black. And he was shocked and frustrated and angered by the way that his black children were treated on their way home after school, which was so different than how his white children were treated. And the talk and talks that he had to have with them. This boy who asked the question knows that if you have grown up in this country, you are more likely to see black people, especially black men, as a threat. Now, for many people, this is not a conscious fear, but an unconscious one. One of those implicit racial biases in our hidden brains that can adversely affect our thoughts and our actions, especially when we find ourselves in a stressful situation. Now, last week I talked about the implicit association test, which is a psychological test that helps reveal our unconscious implicit biases around things like race or sex or class, a host of things. And what a test like this reveals is that in our country, in our culture, most people implicitly associate white people with positive qualities and characteristics, and people of color with negative qualities and characteristics. And again, for lots of people, these are implicit associations that do not always represent our conscious values, but they are there, and they have to be reckoned with. Because sometimes they influence us in contrast to what we would consciously like to do. And so it does behoove us to become aware of them, because as one person said, while we may not have much power to eradicate our unconscious biases, we can counteract them. And the first step is to turn a hidden bias into a visible one. And our implicit racial biases, they not only become visible in psychological tests, they become visible in brain scans. So in 2001, there was a facial recognition study that was done using a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, or a functional MRI. Now, in this study, people were put into this functional MRI scanner, and they were shown a series of pictures that would just flash. And then they would record what happened in the brain, what areas of the brain would light up or not be activated. And in this study, white subjects were shown unfamiliar faces of other white people, as well as unfamiliar faces of black people, people of color. Now, when any of us sees anything, the first thing that our brain has to figure out is what it's looking at. And faces are quite interesting because there is actually a particular area of the brain that lights up specifically in response to faces. And this area is called the fusiform gyrus. So when the test subjects in this study were shown unfamiliar white faces, this part of the brain, this part that recognizes faces, lit up with activity. But when these same people were shown pictures of unfamiliar faces of people of color, something different happened. There was little or no activation of the fusiform gyrus. Instead, the area that lit up was the amygdala. Now, the amygdala does lots of things for us. It helps regulate our memory, and it is the area of the brain that deals primarily with emotional responses, especially fear. What this means then is that when these white subjects were shown pictures of black and brown people, their brain did not see them as persons, but as threats. And again, this isn't a conscious response, this is an unconscious reaction. And we all know that when we feel threatened, when we become afraid, we do not always act rationally. That when we become fearful, we act in ways that will sometimes override our conscious values. And we end up hurting other people unintentionally. And hopefully when things like this happen, we can let go of defending ourselves, and instead we can join the Apostle Paul, who confesses his failures and laments his human condition. We heard it today. I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I don't do the good I want, but the evil that I don't want is what I end up doing. In my inmost self, I delight in the law of God. But I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? I would encourage you to go back and read Romans 7, even Romans 5, 6, and 7. And when Paul talks about sin, think of particular types of sin as you're reading it. So instead of sin generically, think of the different sort of isms that we have in our life and see what those feel like as you read Paul's words. Who will rescue me from this body of death? And that really is the question. Who will rescue us? Who will save us from ourselves? Who will save us from the host of implicit biases, the racism, the sexism, the classism, all the other isms that literally dwell within the members of our body? Now, this week I highlight this particular facial recognition study because not only does it offer further confirmation of our implicit racial bias, which we really have to acknowledge if we're going to make any progress in racial reconciliation. But this study also offered a glimmer of hope, a way forward. Because there was another part of the study which was interesting. As I mentioned before, in the first part, they just put people in the scanner, flashed pictures of unfamiliar faces, and then registered what activated in the brain. But in another part of the study, they made one procedural change. Before the white subjects were put into the MRI scanner, they were quickly shown a picture of an unfamiliar person of color, and then they spent about 20 to 30 seconds giving some information about who this person was. And so then, when the subjects were put into the scanner, when the unfamiliar faces flashed before their eyes and they looked at what happened in the brain, what they discovered, that it wasn't the amygdala, but the fusiform gyrus that activated. In other words, it was a face again. A little bit of familiarity transformed the white subject's unconscious response. The unfamiliar black face was no longer a threat, but a person. And other studies have confirmed this finding, namely, that a small amount of familiarity can have a positive effect on the way a person's hidden brain responds. Familiarity can make our hidden brain, can make our unconscious mind an ally. And in this world today, we need all the allies that we can get. What does this mean for us? Well, Jesus didn't have to administer implicit association tests to know what was wrong with human beings. Paul didn't need to do functional MRI scans to know what was wrong with human beings. And both of them said that what we need is one another. Both of them, in their own ways, talked about reaching out to people who are different than we are. Not to help them, but to be in relationship with them. Because we cannot be fully who we are if we're not in relationship with others. And we cannot be full in our humanity if we are not in relationship with others who have different lives than we have, who have different experiences, who look different and sound different than we are. But the fact is, most of our lives are structured around those people that are already like us in lots of ways. And it takes special effort to not only become familiar with people who are different than we are, but to enter into significant relationships where we impinge on one another. And I have to tell you, I'm getting kind of tired of making confessions during my sermons. But you know, I did a little bit of research for this one. In particular, I looked back at a sermon that I did 3 years ago, because it was year A, these readings, and I was shocked. I was talking about implicit bias. I was talking about the need for kinship, the need to reach out and develop relationships with people who are different than we are. And I've looked over the past 3 years. I haven't done that. And I feel like God has given me these words to speak, but with every word that I speak, I feel convicted. How can I make it so that white people aren't scared of me? Still don't know how to fully answer that question. But one thing I would say is, it's not your problem to figure out. It's my problem to figure out. White people have to figure this out. Because it's not you that made us afraid of you. It's we who made ourselves afraid of you. So we have to find ways to lean in, to be guided by the Spirit into foreign lands, into uncomfortable places, to where we can develop genuine friendships and relationships with people that we normally wouldn't. Because that is where our future lies. This is the work of God. This is the work of the Spirit. And this is work that we've got to figure out. Amen.